Hello, I am teacher Guohar Huang. Today I would like to introduce Unit 4, How to Conduct an Experimental Design. Today's presentation will cover the principles of experimental design, problematic experimental design, and reasonable quasi-experimental design. In addition, we will also explore the comparison of different teaching strategies for different students and the comparison of the same teaching strategy for different students. First, let's talk about the principles of experimental design. We conduct teaching experiments, usually to prove the effectiveness of a specific intervention. Therefore, the principle is to add one intervention at a time. For example, we want to know whether adding strategies to a game increases motivation to learn, or will adding mind maps improve learning effectiveness. In this case, games or mind maps are our intervention. Only introduce a bit of new stuff at a time. If games and mind maps are added simultaneously, even if they accommodate learning motivation or effectiveness, it will be difficult for us to draw conclusions. Does the game cause it, or is it caused by mind maps? In addition, when designing experiments, we must pay special attention to whether the control group is treated fairly. For example, the experimental group had 1 hour per week to review digital games. So, what was the control group doing that hour? Is that hour just self-study, or are there other traditional review modes? In other words, we must treat them fairly so that the objective environment between the experimental and control groups is fair. When the experimental group designs an activity, the control group should have corresponding activities. The method used in the experimental group is the new method we want to try, while the control group uses the general or traditional methods. Also, do the experimental and control groups have the same teachers? Do you have the same study time? Are you studying the same textbook content? These are very important. Finally, whether it is an experimental group or a control group, each group must have at least 30 people, so it is statistically more convincing and acceptable to everyone. Let's first look at problematic experimental designs. This is called a single group experimental design. A single group design has no control group with which to compare. It has a pre-test, a learning strategy intervention, and a post-test. You can observe the comparison between pre-test and post-test. For example, if the pre-test only has a score of 30 points and the post-test has a variable score of 50, we will say that it has improved by 20 points. But this involves several issues. First, are the pre-test and post-test equally tricky? If the difficulty is different, turning 30 points into 50 points does not mean that it is a progress process, because maybe getting 50 points is because the test is relatively easy. In addition, there should be progress if there is learning, so there is nothing wrong with this learning leading to progress. But how does it compare to self-study? How does it compare with traditional teacher teaching? How does it compare to watching instructional videos on your own? Without a benchmark for comparison, it is difficult to say whether or not the current new learning methods are suitable. Therefore, the single group experimental design is less convincing. In addition, an experimental design without a pretest is also a problematic experimental design. For example, the experimental group used mobile learning, while the control group used traditional on-site learning. These two groups have different ways of learning. If we find that the post-test of the experimental group is better than the control groups, we say that the mobile learning method is better. Such a conclusion needs to be revised. It is also possible that the students in the experimental group are inherently better than those in the control group. Therefore, we should add a pretest before the experiment to confirm that the levels of the two groups are equivalent before we can compare the post-test. That is to say, we must understand its original state. Therefore, without a pretest experimental design, it is difficult to determine who has better learning results. The second problem with this experimental design is that it involves too many variables simultaneously. We mentioned before that if you give two variables simultaneously, even if you find a good result, you can't conclude which intervention caused it. For example, the experimental group had mobile learning plus concept mapping, while the control group only had traditional learning, no mobile learning, and no concept mapping. Although there is a pretest to confirm that their starting points are equivalent and a post-test to compare their differences, there is no way to make an attribution. In this case, it will be more difficult when our research results are presented. Therefore, a more reasonable quasi-experimental design involves two groups, experimental and control groups. There is a pretest and a post-test. The two groups should have little difference in learning strategies, methods, or technological intervention, one difference at a time. For example, compare mobile learning with traditional on-site learning. Both are on-site learning. The only difference is whether a mobile phone or tablet is used as a learning device. By the way, what is a quasi-experimental design? What is a true experimental design? This is a true experimental design if our experimental and control groups randomly assign all students to two groups using random numbers. However, we usually cannot do this in experiments at school. We may have two classes. One class is the experimental group, and the other class is the control group. This kind of two-class, where there is no way to separate the students, is directly assigned to the experimental and control groups, called a quasi-experimental design. Let's look at this example. This paradigm is also a reasonable experimental design. The experimental group used concept mapping mobile learning, while the control group used general mobile learning. Both V groups use mobile vehicles. However, one has a concept map added and the other does not. We can clearly understand whether adding concept maps will affect the learning effect in the context of mobile learning. Of course, we can also use three groups. This allows for more comparisons. For example, the experimental group had concept mapping plus mobile learning, the control group 1 had only mobile learning, and the control group 2 had only on-site learning of concept mapping, but no mobile learning. We can now compare the experimental group with control group 1. You can also compare the experimental group with the control group 2. It is equivalent to conducting two experiments at the same time. The advantage is that you can quickly know whether the concept map is more effective, the mobile learning is more effective, or the two simultaneously are more effective. But in this case, the number of people in our experiment must be 90. In other words, we must find three classes of 30 people each. Of course, we can also divide the experimental subjects into four groups. In addition to the previous three groups, a group engages in traditional on-site learning. That is, there is no mobile learning and no concept mapping. Currently, the four groups are complete, making it easier to analyze and compare. Does the concept map have a more significant impact? Or does mobile learning have a greater impact? Or will the combined effect of the two be better? This allows for a more detailed analysis and discussion. Sometimes we only have one class, or because of practical considerations, we cannot divide the courses into experimental and control groups. At this time, we can also do another kind of research to compare the same teaching strategies with different human factors. For example, we must use the same teaching method, and I may use a new teaching method called game-based learning. However, I want to discuss not the comparison between game-based learning and traditional learning, but whether there are any differences between boys and girls in this kind of game-based learning. Our experimental subjects should be divided equally between boys and girls, and then we will analyze their differences. Of course, this also requires a pre-test and a post-test. We could compare different cognitive styles, such as the impact of serialist and holist students on game-based learning. In the same learning environment, whether students with different cognitive styles will produce different results is something we can do. The cognitive style or learning style referred to here has many classifications. This refers to one of them, called the serialist and holist type. Some people like to learn things in a fixed order, but some people want to learn by leaps and bounds. They will read whatever they find interesting. Just like when we go to an amusement park, some people like to follow the first attraction planned by the amusement park to the second, to the third, and follow the arrow indicators 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 90, and so on. This is a serialist. But some people will look at the map and say, I want to play the fifth roller coaster the most, so I will play it first. I wanted to play that Poseidon, so I went for it, not in a prescribed order. I play whatever I like. This kind of person is a holistic person, because he usually looks at the overall content first and then decides on his order. We also often analyze and compare different prior knowledge. For example, the impact of high prior knowledge and low prior knowledge on the results of a specific learning method. This is also commonly used. We usually use pre-tests to divide students into high prior knowledge and low prior knowledge, and then compare the performance of the entire behavior or changes in learning effectiveness. Of course, we can also consider human factors and different teaching strategies simultaneously. For example, the experimental group uses mobile learning with concept maps, while the control group only has general mobile learning without concept maps. However, we also want to know whether such a new intervention will have the same results for boys and girls. So we divided the sample of the experimental group into half boys and half girls, and the control group was also divided into half boys and half girls. In this way, we can perform all two-factor analyses. However, if we want to do such an experiment, our sample size will be 120 people. There are 60 people in the experimental group and 60 in the control group. There should be 30 boys and 30 girls among the 60 students in the experimental group. Similarly, the control group also requires 30 boys and 30 girls. This will make it more convincing when doing statistical analysis in the future. For the same thing, we can replace gender with different prerequisite knowledge, such as high and low prerequisite knowledge. A similar analysis can be performed. Of course, you can also replace gender or prior knowledge with different cognitive styles. This is all possible. Of course, it is also possible to replace gender or prior knowledge with different cognitive styles. In addition, the pre-test and post-test learning content do not necessarily have to be the same. The pre-test can also be used as the test for the last exam on the same subject. Its primary purpose is to compare whether the basic abilities of the two groups of students are the same. The post-test must test the content taught in this teaching activity so that it is meaningful. Of course, the pre-test can also take the same questions as the post-test. However, several things could be improved with this. The first one is the problem of leaking the title. If students have seen the questions, they can study these questions. The second question may involve memorizing the answer. If students have already read the question, they may memorize the answers without understanding. Therefore, when designing the post-test, the order of questions and answers must be changed if the same questions must be used. Don't give students the chance to memorize answers. In addition, the number of questions should be more significant so that students will not remember the details of these questions. Another way is to use pre- and post-test questions with the same difficulty, if possible. But it is not easy to prove that the difficulty is the same. Usually, it is easier to do this only if the difficulty of the question is proved to be the same through extensive data analysis, normality analysis, etc., such as in language proficiency tests. If we want to compare students' progress, we usually use pre-tests and post-tests to compare. At this time, special attention should be paid to the difficulty. The content of the questions may be the same, but the order in which the questions and answer options are presented is different. In addition, the questionnaire is divided into a pre-questionnaire and a post-questionnaire. Generally speaking, many questionnaires, such as learning motivation, learning interest, and learning attitude, can be filled out before and after the experiment. Before the experiment, we can ask students about their motivation, interests, and attitudes. After the experiment, we can also ask students about their learning motivation, learning interest, and learning attitude in this learning activity. This way, you can compare whether this learning activity has changed students' motivation, interest, and attitude. In addition, some questionnaires are usually only used at the front because they are used to classify students, for example, a learning style questionnaire or a cognitive style questionnaire. In addition, some questionnaires are only used to help explain why there are such results or some very emotional feelings. For example, a satisfaction questionnaire or a cognitive load questionnaire. These are usually only used in post-tests because this must be done after the learning activity is over, before we can ask the students whether they are satisfied with the activity or whether the cognitive load of this activity is heavy. This is the end of today's unit. Finally, ask students to do an exercise on their own. Plan a reasonable experimental design according to your research topic. Each activity in the experimental design process must indicate its length of time. For example, it takes a few minutes to fill in the questionnaire, a few minutes to take the pretest, and how many times the learning activity needs to be carried out. A total of several weeks, a few classes per week, and a few minutes per class. This must be written clearly. In addition, the number of people in each group should also be written clearly. Also, practice planning your pre-test and post-test papers, indicating the types of documents and the number of questions. In addition, students should prepare the pre- and post-questionnaires. You can use the existing questionnaire we discussed before, or, of course, you can design your questionnaire. However, creating your questionnaire requires at least 2 experts to review it. This is expert validity, which has been mentioned before. This is today's unit. If you have any questions, please get in touch with me and discuss. Thanks. Bye-bye.